The Haunting of 112 Ocean Avenue. We moved into 112 Ocean Avenue on a bright, sun-soaked afternoon, the kind of day that promises good things. The house stood proud, its weathered clapboards glistening under the summer sun. From the outside, it looked like the picture of serenity, a home straight out of a dream. The shutters were painted white, the front door a cheery red. It had that classic, comforting feel. But I noticed it immediately. The way the house seemed to stand just a little too still, as if holding its breath. The air, despite the warmth, carried a chill. My wife brushed off my unease, claiming I had spent too many nights watching late-night horror movies. "This is our fresh start," she said, her eyes lighting up at the space, the possibilities. She couldn't have known. None of us could. We'd barely unpacked when things began to feel wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just small things. Misplaced items, cold spots in the hallway, and that nagging sense that something, or someone, was watching. I could feel it whenever I turned a corner, that prickle at the back of my neck, like unseen eyes tracking my every step. At night, it was worse. The first night, I heard what I thought was the house settling, creaks and groans as the walls adjusted to their new inhabitants. But then came the whispers. It started as a faint sound, almost indistinguishable, as if carried on a draft. But no, it was more than the wind. Voices. Faint. Too low to understand, but there. They slithered through the walls, rising and falling, muttering words that seemed just beyond the edge of comprehension. I didn't sleep much that night. On the second day, my wife noticed something odd in the basement. She called me down to see it, her voice oddly hushed, nervous. The light bulb flickered weakly as I descended the stairs. The basement smelled of damp earth, the air heavy with the stench of something long forgotten. In the far corner beneath an old tarp we found it, scratches, deep gouges in the concrete floor, as though someone, or something, had been trying to claw their way out. There were stains, dark and dried, spread in jagged patterns. Blood. "It's just an old house," I said, my voice barely steady. "Things like this happen." She nodded, but the fear in her eyes mirrored my own. We left the basement quickly. That night, the house felt alive. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. There was a low thud from somewhere deep inside the house. I sat up, my heart hammering. Footsteps. They weren't coming from inside the house, no. They were coming from beneath us, from the basement. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth beneath our bed. The sound was unmistakable, and they were getting closer. I froze, listening, my breath catching in my throat. Then silence. For a moment, I let myself believe it was over. That's when I heard the soft creak of the bedroom door slowly opening. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. A shadow fell across the floor. Something darker than the night itself. It shifted, elongated, growing taller, stretching toward me. And then came the smell, rotting flesh, thick and suffocating. I gagged, covering my mouth as the figure stood in the doorway. My wife stirred beside me, oblivious to the horror standing just feet away. I wanted to scream, to wake her, but the sound wouldn't come. The thing shifted again, and I saw it. A face. Not human, twisted and deformed, its eyes hollow and hungry, locked on me with a hatred so intense it felt like my skin was being peeled away. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The door was closed. The footsteps faded back into the silence of the house. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I didn't tell her what I'd seen. I convinced myself it was a dream, a trick of the mind. But the house knew better. It wanted me to know better. By dusk, the whispers were back, louder now, almost mocking. They swirled through the rooms, calling my name. The third night, something woke me. Not a noise this time, no. It was the feeling of something cold pressed against my arm. I bolted upright. There, on the bed beside me, was the imprint of a hand, pressed deep into the mattress, right where my wife should have been. She was gone. I shot out of bed, my mind racing. The air was thick, stifling, filled with the same smell of decay from the night before. I called her name, frantically searching every room, but she wasn't there. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I checked the basement last, my hands shaking as I flicked the light on. The bulb flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into darkness. My breath came in short, ragged bursts. The scratches on the floor seemed deeper now, fresh, and the stains, they were wet. I stepped forward, my foot sinking into something slick. I reached out, touching the wall, and felt warm, sticky blood coating the concrete. Then I heard it. A voice, not from the walls this time, but from behind me. "Leave." I turned, and there, standing at the base of the stairs, was my wife, but it wasn't her. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and her face, Her face was smeared with blood, her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. "We're not alone," she whispered. And then the lights came back on. She was gone. But the whisper, that low, terrifying voice lingered in the air. I wasn't sure if it was the house speaking or something far worse. The next morning I woke to find my wife lying beside me, her chest rising and falling softly as if nothing had happened. The blood, the whispers, the strange figure from the basement. It all seemed like a distant, twisted nightmare. I wanted to believe it was, but deep down I knew better. The house had shown its hand, and I had seen the depths of what it could do. She stirred awake, smiling at me with sleepy eyes, and for a moment I almost asked her. I almost told her everything I'd seen, but something stopped me, something in her gaze. Her eyes were tired, distant, as though she hadn't slept well. But there was something else, something colder. It chilled me to the bone. I didn't say a word. The day dragged on in silence. We unpacked boxes, trying to settle in, but every room felt wrong. The walls seemed too close, the air too heavy, and that smell, faint but lingering, like something festering just beneath the surface. In the afternoon, I went back down to the basement. I don't know why. Maybe I needed proof that I wasn't losing my mind. The light was dim, casting long shadows that crawled up the walls like clawed hands. I stepped carefully toward the corner where the gouges in the floor had been, my stomach twisting with each step. I half expected to find something waiting for me there, something waiting in the dark. But when I reached the corner, the scratches were gone. The floor was smooth, untouched, as if nothing had ever been there. I froze, staring at the concrete. My pulse pounded in my ears. No, I had seen it. The scratches, the stains, they were real. They had to be. But now there was nothing, only the faint echo of my own breathing. That night it started again. The footsteps. Not from the basement this time, but from the hallway just outside our bedroom. Heavy, deliberate. Pacing. My wife was asleep beside me, her breaths even, oblivious. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The doorknob rattled, slowly at first, then more violently. My breath caught in my throat, and then the door creaked open. I squinted into the hallway, expecting to see it again. That twisted figure, that horrible face, but there was nothing. The hall was empty, but then I heard the whisper. "Come with us!" My blood ran cold. The voice wasn't from the hallway. It wasn't outside. It was right there, beside me. I turned slowly, my skin crawling with dread. She was sitting up, her eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. Her lips barely moved as the words slipped out again. "Come with us." I reached out, touching her arm. Hey, wake up, you're dreaming." She didn't move. Her skin felt cold, too cold. And then, slowly, she turned to me. Her eyes were glassy, almost hollow, and for the briefest second, I didn't recognize her. Her mouth twisted into that same unnatural grin I had seen the night before, the grin that didn't belong to her. "Come with us," she whispered again, her voice no longer her own. I yanked my hand back, scrambling out of bed. My heart raced as she slowly laid back down, her eyes still locked on me, her grin widening. And then, without warning, she was asleep again, just like that, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, frozen, watching her for what felt like hours. My skin prickled with fear, the room growing colder by the second. I didn't go back to bed that night. The next morning, she didn't remember a thing. She laughed it off when I told her about the talking in her sleep, saying it was just stress. She hadn't been sleeping well, after all. But I knew. I had seen it. That wasn't her in the bed with me last night. As the days passed, the house grew darker. It wasn't just the shadows, though they seemed to stretch farther than they should, creeping across the walls like something alive. No, it was the feeling, the suffocating presence that pressed down on me at all hours. Like the house itself was breathing, watching, waiting. It was around the fourth night that the real terror began. I woke to the sound of something moving in the walls. Not the creaking or settling of an old house, no. This was something else, something wet, slithering, dragging itself through the hollow spaces between the studs. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right above me. I could hear it now, clear as day, scratching. Something clawing at the wood, at the very fabric of the house. I grabbed the lamp from my bedside and made my way into the hallway, the sound following me with every step. It was above me, behind me, all around me, and then suddenly it stopped. Silence. I stood there in the middle of the hallway, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The house was still, too still. And then I heard it, a low, wet sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I turned slowly, my body trembling. At the end of the hallway, just past the stairs, something was crawling. Its body was twisted, contorted. its limbs too long, its head hanging at an impossible angle. It dragged itself forward, one arm reaching out, its fingers clawing into the wood, pulling itself toward me. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was only when it lifted its head that I saw its face. It was my wife, or what was left of her. Her eyes were gone, empty sockets staring back at me, and her mouth was twisted into that same horrible grin. Blood dripped from her lips, her skin pale and rotting. She spoke, her voice a sickening rasp. "Come with us." The words echoed through the house, filling every corner, every shadow. And then the lights went out. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the living room. The house was quiet now. Too quiet. My body ached, every inch of me screaming in pain, but I was alive. Somehow I was alive. I stumbled to my feet, my heart still pounding in my chest. The figures, the whispers, my wife, they were gone. The house was still, but I wasn't alone. Standing in the doorway, covered in blood, was my wife. Only this time her eyes were clear, human. She looked at me, confused, her lips trembling as if she didn't understand why I was staring at her like that. "Honey?" she whispered, her voice shaky. "What's wrong?" I took a step back, my mind reeling. I wanted to believe it was her. I wanted to believe this nightmare was over. But then I saw it. On the floor, just beneath her feet, was a trail of blood, thick, dark, and fresh. It snaked across the room, leading back to the hallway. And then I realized the blood wasn't hers. I took another step back, my heart pounding, and she looked down. Her eyes widened in horror as she saw the blood trailing from the hallway. Slowly she turned, her face going pale. I heard it before she did, the soft, wet sound of something crawling, something coming. And this time it wasn't her. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to keep my eyes forward, to press the pedal down and never look back. But I had to. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like my chest would explode. And I knew that whatever was sitting in the back seat wasn't going to wait for long. Slowly, I shifted my gaze to the rearview mirror. There it was, sitting in the back seat, staring at me with those empty, hollow eyes. Its face was pale and bloated, its skin stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. And that grin, twisted, grotesque, seemed even wider now, stretching impossibly across its face. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just sat there, watching, waiting. The breath caught in my throat. My hands tightened around the steering wheel, my knuckles white. Beside me, my wife hadn't noticed. She was staring out the window, her body trembling, lost in her own terror. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. Don't turn around." She blinked, confused. "What?" "Just don't look back." I could hear the panic creeping into my voice, the tremble I couldn't control. "We need to get out of here, fast." She opened her mouth to argue, but then she saw it, in the mirror, just as I had. Her face went pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Slowly she turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, it can't be." But it was. The thing in the back seat shifted slightly, its grin widening. Blood dripped from the corners of its mouth, staining the seat. It looked like me, just like me. But there was something terribly wrong, something broken about it. Its eyes were hollow, and its skin was starting to rot, peeling away in chunks, revealing the muscle and bone underneath. And then it spoke. "You should have stayed." The voice was my own, but twisted, distorted, as though coming from deep within the house itself. The air in the car grew cold, and the windows fogged up. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward as the tires screeched against the asphalt. We hurtled down the dark road, the headlights cutting through the blackness. The thing in the back seat never moved, never flinched. It just kept staring at me, those dead, empty eyes boring into the back of my head. My wife was shaking now, her hands clutching at the seat, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't know what it was, but I knew we had to get away. Far away. The house wasn't done with us yet. Then the car jerked to the side. The steering wheel twisted in my hands, as if something had taken control. I fought it, swerving back onto the road, but it was no use. The car veered violently, pulling us toward the ditch. "Stop!" my wife screamed. "What are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything!" I shouted back, my hands shaking as I wrestled with the wheel. And then the whisper came again. "Come with us." It was louder this time, filling the car, bouncing off the walls. The thing in the back seat leaned forward, its breath cold against the back of my neck. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching as we slid to the side of the road. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment we just sat there, breathing heavily, our hearts pounding in unison. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but this time, the thing was gone. The back seat was empty. "We need to get out," I whispered. Now, my wife didn't argue. We threw open the doors and stumbled out of the car, the cold night air hitting us like a slap. I looked around, my pulse still racing, but there was no sign of it. The thing, whatever it was, but something was wrong. The road, it wasn't the same. The trees were closer, thicker, casting long twisted shadows that seemed to reach for us. And in the distance, barely visible through the fog, was the house. 112 Ocean Avenue. It didn't make sense. We had driven miles away from that place. But there it was, standing tall and dark, the windows like empty eyes staring down at us. "We didn't leave," my wife whispered, her voice trembling. "We never left." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The house had never let us go. No matter how far we drove, no matter how fast, we had never really escaped. And then, from behind us, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. We turned, and there it was, the figure from the house, standing in the middle of the road. Its head was cocked to one side, its face split by that awful grin. Blood dripped from its fingers, pooling on the ground beneath it. "Come with us," it rasped, its voice no longer human. "You belong here." I backed away, my mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. The road was gone. The house loomed behind us, the only escape swallowed by the fog. My wife grabbed my hand, her grip tight, and we ran. We ran toward the house, toward the door, the only thing we could see in the thickening mist. We had no choice. We had to get inside. The door creaked open as we approached, as if the house was waiting for us. As we crossed the threshold, I heard it again, a soft, low laugh echoing through the empty halls, the same laugh I had heard before, only this time it wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from me. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. My wife turned, her eyes wide with horror as she stared at me. And then I felt it, the cold, rotting hand on my shoulder. I turned slowly, the realization sinking in, chilling me to the core. The figure standing behind me, it wasn't my wife. It had never been her, not since that first night. Her face, twisted and decaying, grinned up at me, its hollow eyes locking with mine. Blood dripped from her lips as she whispered, "Come with us." I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced over at my wife, no, the thing wearing her face, and my mind raced. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. I had felt that cold touch, heard that mocking laugh. This was happening. The house was playing with us, twisting reality into something I couldn't understand. My wife, or the thing pretending to be her, took a step toward me, her movements jerky, unnatural. "You've always been here," she whispered, her voice deeper now, layered with something sinister. "You belong with us." My back hit the wall, and I realized there was nowhere to run. The house had trapped me. I glanced at the open door, but the fog outside was thick, impenetrable. It was as if the outside world had been swallowed whole. There was no escape. Suddenly I felt a searing pain in my chest. I gasped, clutching at my heart, and for a moment I thought it would stop beating altogether. But then the pain faded, leaving behind a cold, empty feeling that spread through my entire body. I looked down at my hands. They weren't my hands anymore. The skin was pale, gray, peeling away in chunks, revealing the rotting flesh beneath. My fingers twisted and contorted, the nails blackened and sharp. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I stared at myself, horrified. I was becoming one of them. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out was low, guttural. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't me. My wife, the real one, was gone. She had been gone for days, maybe longer, and now I understood. The house hadn't just haunted us. It had claimed us, piece by piece, dragging us into its rotting core, turning us into something else. And now it had me. The figure wearing my wife's face grinned wider, stepping closer until her cold breath brushed against my skin. "You're part of the house now," she whispered. "You always were." I wanted to fight, to push her away, but I couldn't. My limbs were heavy, my body sinking deeper into the decaying skin that had once been mine. The whispers swirled around me again, louder now, filling my mind, drowning out everything else. "You belong here." I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, but there was none left to breathe. The house had taken it, just as it had taken everything else. And then, as my vision blurred and the world around me darkened, I felt it again, that cold, rotting hand, pulling me deeper into the house, into the darkness. I wasn't leaving. I had never left. I was part of 112 Ocean Avenue now, forever.